As almost everybody knows, there has been a revolution in the field of biotechnology. Scientific advances have opened the door to unprecedented possibilities regarding our genetic futures. Along with these new discoveries have also come heated philosophical and ethical arguments about the implications of all this. Two new books frame the opposing sides of the debate. In his book, Our Post-Human Future, social philosopher Francis Fukuyama argues that biotechnology threatens to alter human nature, what it means to be human. Scientist Gregory Stock's new book, Redesigning Humans, makes the case that nothing can stop the impulse to manipulate human heredity, and I want to have them share that debate with you this evening. I am pleased to have Francis Fukuyama and Gregory Stock on this program. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's just lay out better than I just did, you know, the philosophical or the divide that separates you as you approach the specifics. I'll start with you, Francis.
Well, in my view, the big challenge that's ahead of us is not in the use of genetic engineering, for example, for therapeutic purposes, which I don't have any trouble with. I think the problem comes when you begin talking about human enhancement. And as Greg has done in his book, you know, talking about actually consciously taking over the evolutionary process. And I think that's problematic for me for a number of reasons. I mean, there are, I think, safety concerns, utilitarian safety concerns, but beyond that, I think there's some real philosophical issues about whether we actually know enough as to what constitutes an improvement in the human species. And to me, you know, I look at the last 200 years where people have tried to socially engineer better societies using very crude things like labor camps and agitprop and so forth. And now it seems to me we are beginning on a period where you're going to be able to come at this problem again, but you're going to use tools like genetic engineering, you know, neuropharmacology. I mean, a lot of technological ways of manipulating the way we humans are that I think could easily have as disastrous social consequences as 20th century social engineering.
Yeah, but you're talking about social engineering, and I don't think that that is in the cards, and that would be extremely dangerous because, you know, it's these visions of the greater good that are able to perpetrate enormous evils in the world. But the reality is that we are unraveling our biology. We're learning what makes life tick, and it's just natural that we're going to adjust and modify our biology in all sorts of ways that allow us to enhance our lives. And it seems to me that as long as these choices are largely in the hands of individuals, and that we exclude a realm of possibilities that everyone would agree are just egregious sort of things that we don't want to do.
Now, what are those, just so we understand what's egregious that we don't want to do?
Well, if you're going to make selections of embryos, for example, or you would damage an embryo that would turn out to injure a future child, something that most people would say that's wrong. We shouldn't do that sort of thing. Or there will be certain types of pharmacological manipulations that probably are not desirable because they're very damaging to the individual. But there are large realms where the battle is really one that is ideological. It's a question, there's going to be a great deal of disagreement about these issues. We're never going to reach consensus about them. And to think that we're actually going to hold back these technologies, it seems to me, is just putting our heads in the sand. These are going to go on all over the world, and they're going to become easier and easier as we move forward.
So even if you believed, as Francis did, that it's not good in our interest, you don't think it can be stopped, that technology, that science cannot be stopped, because if you stop it here, someone else will push it forward over here.
Right, and it's not like nuclear weapons where someone makes an error somewhere and suddenly millions of innocent bystanders get vaporized. It's the dangers are really to those early users who are taking additional risk, and in that process are providing us with significant information as a society. And I actually believe that the benefits just far outweigh the risks. But, I mean, take an example of anti-aging medicine. If it were actually possible to intervene to retard the fundamental process of aging so that we were to extend our health span by a decade or something of that sort, does anybody really believe that we're not going to use this technology? I mean, we spend so much today on vitamins and things that don't work.
Well, let me ask Francis, does anybody believe we're not going to use that technology? And do you have any objection to technology in which you somehow understand the mechanisms of cells, and therefore the normal life cycle of cells would be extended and enhanced so that they would not, for the lack of a better word, die as early as they do, so the cells wouldn't shut down, causing death?
Well, I think actually that kind of extension of human lifespan is a good example of something that is individually rational for people. I mean, who wouldn't want to live to 150, but socially could, have very, very negative consequences, because in all societies, progress, social change, the ability to adapt depends actually on generational succession. And so if you don't have one generation succeeding another, the rate of innovation, of political change, of all sorts of social adaptations is simply going to slow down. But, I don't think it is, I think that Greg's talk is right, that you cannot stop science, which is the accumulation of knowledge about things, but you can certainly shape the way that technology is used and deployed. And I would just look at the example of biomedical technology today. We vastly slow down the rate at which scientific progress occurs in medicine, in human medicine, for the sake of ethical concerns over research subject. We have all of these very elaborate rules to protect the human subjects of experimentation. We could move much faster if we, permitted, poorly educated subjects or third world peoples, to be the subjects of clinical trials. And yet we hold back on that because we, worry about ethical consequences of doing certain things.
Well, how do you feel about stem cell research?
I have always been in favor of stem cell research.
So you disagree with the president in terms of holding it back within existing
I agreed
lines?
I agreed with the old NIH restrictions. I mean, I'm not a pro-lifer, and so I thought that it would be fine to continue with it under the kinds of conditions that the NIH had set down. So he's a little bit more restrictive than my preference. But yeah, I think that would be fine. But that's not the issue. I mean, the embryos is one set of issues, but I think that's, in a way, in the long run, the least important.
Well, but you point out, I'll come right to you, Greg, but you point out that one example that would be suggest the kind of problems if cloning was allowed, and that someone might want a husband and a wife, and as they grow older, if in fact the wife is cloned from her tissue, and all of a sudden there is a young person who looks exactly like the wife, it might be disruptive in the family. Am I reciting your example?
Yeah, it seems to me that that's a setup for a not very healthy family situation. And, in many ways, I mean, I think cloning is actually a little bit like incest. I mean, there's a combination of safety plus, ethical concerns. It's not a big deal in the sense that there are not a lot of people, interested in cloning themselves, just as there are not a lot of people interested in committing incest. But at the margins, I think, it does set up certain unhealthy family dynamics, which I think would be one consideration for the ban on reproductive cloning.
But these are the kinds of issues that I think are very, very difficult for us to make political judgments about. And it's easy to conjure up all sorts of images of the dangerous possibilities of the future. And yet, generally, those tell us a lot more about ourselves than they really tell us about the challenges that we'll face in the future. I mean, the reality is that we're extremely ignorant about what the possibilities are that are going to emerge and exactly what the challenges will be.
So is that an incentive to go to go faster or go slower?
It's an incentive to actually allow early experimentation to occur, because you don't buy this knowledge and wisdom by sitting back and thinking about the possibilities of the future that you know nothing about. You buy them by having feedback mechanisms where you get early knowledge about errors that are made. I mean, face it, these technologies are very powerful. They're going to be abused like any other technology is, and there are going to be mistakes, there are going to be errors, and it's going to be a process of trial and error as we move our way forward. Now, an example is sex selection, which many people oppose the notion of sex selection and say, well, that would be horrible. I mean, imagine if you have huge gender imbalances that arise. Well, yeah, that's a reasonable thing to say, and if they arose, then that would be a problem. As it turns out, in the United States, where it's legal to practice sex selection at this point, there are no large imbalances. In fact, there's a tiny increase in the number of girls by family couples who make those choices. I don't see any damage created by allowing a couple that has a very, very strong aversion to having a child of one gender to have the child of the gender that they choose. So that's an example where you can imagine real negative consequences, but in reality they don't occur. So I'm not saying not to regulate any of these things, but to wait to look at real consequences and then try and deal with those problems as they arise. Cloning is very, very distant right now. I don't think it's likely to occur in the immediate future, and when it does, it's still going to be hard for that to be turned into a clinical procedure that is available to people generally, and yet there are bills in the Senate where we're willing to sacrifice real individuals with real diseases and real families and real suffering, or the possibilities of cures and treatments for those people, in order to avoid cloning. There are two kinds of risks that are involved in these new and often very challenging and very difficult sort of possibilities that are emerging. One is that we're going to make mistakes and injure people. And the second, which is not usually perceived, is that we're going to sort of be so afraid of the future and of the social consequences of these larger problems that we're going to gum up research and we're going to retard the beneficial medical consequences or possibilities that can arise from these things. An example is anti-aging medicine. Well, the arguments that Frank made about social consequences, I think, could as easily have been made in 1900 when the average life expectancy was in the mid-40s, and say, well, my God, this is going to change all of society. What if we do that? And not only that, what if there was something like birth control so that women didn't have so many children? It would change society, and it has, but we adjust to it.
At the time of the mapping of the human genome, there was much consideration of this idea. How will this change our perception of what it means to be human? Mm-hmm. Part of your argument is this is going to change our understanding of what it means to be human. And I'm not sure I understand what it means to be human and how scientific change and knowing more about our genetic code somehow changes that essence. I mean, in many ways, knowing more about genetic code leads to some very positive kinds of things, not only genetic therapy, but also, as you know, eliminating some of the myths about whether one race is inferior to the other, and those kinds of things.
Oh, no, in fact, I think that's one of the great gains, is the debunking of scientific racism and a lot of other theories that held that genes accounted for, differences in performance between blacks and whites and this sort of thing. But I think that that's exactly what's at risk. I mean, we are a fairly uniform species, fortunately, that is the basis of our equality of political rights in modern America. And I think that, what the manipulation and enhancement of people's genetic inheritance opens up for us is the possibility. In fact, Greg's got a whole chapter in which he talks about, in effect, the kind of speciation of the human race into a lot of different subgroups that are genetically quite different from one another. And I just don't see how this doesn't become a very serious threat to the basic principle of equality that in our country is actually built on a foundation of empirical equality between different kinds of human groups.
Greg?
I mean, there are enormous differences among us, and when we talk about what it means to be human, I think it's more our vision of who we are. And those sorts of things have changed dramatically in the past just by the numbers of children that we have, the length of our lifespans, the way we interact with one another. Technology has huge impacts upon what that sense of meaning is. And I think that there's a tendency, I mean, some of the most challenging things that we're going to have to confront are just knowledge, not even alterations and modifications of our biology. And a good example is the current, it's very politically correct to say, well, there's just 1 in 1,000 letters in the genetic code that's different, therefore we're all essentially the same. Well, of course, we're all animals, we're all mammals, we're all primates, we're all humans. But we are so fine-tuned to the differences among us that they may look non-existent to a visitor from another planet or to a hungry lion who's looking for a meal. But, if you're out looking for a mate, or if you're trying to build a baseball team, you're aware that there are significant differences, not only among individuals, but among separate subpopulations. And a lot of those differences have origins and contributions that are genetic and that are biological. to have to come to grips with those differences in the context of an egalitarian society, and I think to deny them is not a very good start on that.
Let me end with this question. Who defines the difference in genetic enhancement, say, on the one hand, and preventive medicine on the other? Who defines that difference and says this is one thing and this is the other, this is good, this is bad? And then who decides how to go about preventing certain scientific developments that you think are not in the best interest, or whether it has to do with gender selection or whatever it might be, in your judgment? Do we leave this to government?
Well, sure. I mean, who else are you going to leave it to?
I don't know. I'm asking. I mean, that's the point. Is it just simply so you say to Congress, we would like for you to hold some hearings and decide what's good and what's bad, and then write some laws about the future of technology?
Congress does that, with respect to a lot of things. I mean, in a legitimately constituted democracy, Congress makes broad determinations as to what's legitimate and what's illegitimate, and it can delegate that authority to a regulatory agency. We do that today in drug policy. I mean, we say that certain drugs are not good for you. Certain ones are dangerous, certain ones, you shouldn't take, and others are legal, and others are legal under certain, heavily regulated conditions. I think that, for example, I mean, I would like something like a distinction between therapy and enhancement, and to permit therapy but to limit enhancement. And I think we do that all the time in for example, in drug policy, and I think it's something regulatory agencies can do, and they do it routinely.
The question I raise is not even an issue for you.
I don't think I don't think there's any question that a democracy can legitimately, make these kinds of decisions, not to stop knowledge and science, but really to direct the, where technology goes.
Do you find, finally, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I would like to, because I think that actually our political process is not very good at making nuanced choices in these sorts of realms. The political process tends to get hijacked by ideologues on either one side or the other. And we can see this in the abortion debate. There isn't a lot of reasoned general thinking about these issues. And when it comes to enhancement or therapy, the line is a very, very soft one. If you look at anti-aging medicine, that's very obvious. If you were able to actually extend our period of vitality an extra decade, well, that would be an enhancement. It would be something no humans have had before. And yet at the same time, it would be a preventive therapy for all of the age-related diseases that we spend billions and billions of dollars to address today, just to buy an extra 6 months of sort of a tortured life. And so to me, what we need to do is to allow individuals to see the nuances of their personal situations, of their relative values, and the things that they value in life, and allow individuals to make choices as long as they don't injure other people to the extent that they are just not beyond the pale.
And what you hope for, though, is that they have as much considered opinion and information and wisdom that they can access in making those decisions that are in their own personal domain.
And that's where you really need government. I mean, it's to guarantee safety, to guarantee information, and to sort of define a playing field, to give people the tools to make choices that are important to them in their own lives. So that's where Francis and I really differ about these things. And then I don't trust the political process to make these sort of larger contextual judgments about what is good or bad for the individual.
But you do trust it to provide the information, as you just said. That's where we turn to government, you said.
Of course, yes. Yeah. I think that's very, very important.
These two books, there is nothing that is more on the frontier of where we are going in science than this. Redesigning Humans, Our Inevitable Genetic Future from Gregory Stock, and Our Post-Human Future from Francis Fukuyama. Francis has a unique gift for titles. Thank you both, frankly. Thank you very much, Greg.
Good to see you.